Everybody like and subscribe, praise the bell icon. Story number 1.
Every summer, Camp Wrenwood opened its gates to a new group of kids looking for adventure in the dense, pine-shadowed woods of northern Maine. It was old, one of those camps built in the 1950s with creaky cabins, dusty activity sheds, and rumors older than the counselors themselves. But it had a charm, and despite the occasional ghost story around the fire pit, kids came back year after year. In 2016, something changed. That year, a new counselor named Lily joined the staff. She was quiet, kind, and a little reserved, but good with the kids. She had grown up in Maine and mentioned she'd been to Wrenwood herself as a camper years ago, though no one on staff remembered her. Still, nobody thought much of it. The weirdness started the second night in. A camper in cabin 5, an older boy named Jacob, complained that someone was knocking on the window after lights out. His counselor, Mark, figured it was a prank and brushed it off. But then it happened again, and again, soft knocking, always at the window farthest from the bunks. Jacob swore it was a person, pale and thin, just standing there in the dark. A few kids in cabin 6 found deep scratches in their cabin door, long, deliberate ones as if someone had used a knife or claws. The camp director assumed it was a raccoon, but the scratches were too high. And the shape of them? Almost human. One morning, Lily didn't show up for breakfast. Her cabin was empty, her bed untouched. Her things were still there, but she was gone. The director called the local sheriff. They searched the woods, the nearby lake, even brought in dogs. Nothing. No trace of her. That night, the power went out during a thunderstorm. Total blackout. The backup generators were supposed to kick on, but didn't. The counselors scrambled to calm the kids while lightning lit up the camp in broken, flickering glimpses. In the middle of it all, Jacob was found standing outside his cabin in the rain. Soaked to the bone, he was muttering something over and over again. "She's in the woods. She's in the woods. She's watching us." They tried to question him, but he was in some kind of trance. He didn't respond to his name, didn't blink, didn't move, just kept whispering the same line until morning. The next day, something was discovered at the edge of the woods behind the mess hall. A small clearing no one remembered being there before. In the center, a pile of smooth stones arranged in a perfect circle. At the center of the circle, a single wet, muddy counselor uniform. Lily's. The camp closed early that year. Parents were told it was due to unforeseen electrical problems. The counselors were sworn to secrecy. No one ever saw Lily again. But the strangest part? When the director went to check old staff records after the summer ended, there was no file for Lily. No hiring forms, no emergency contact info, nothing. Her name wasn't even on the payroll. Some say Lily had never been hired, that she just appeared that summer. Others whisper she died at that camp years ago, a camper who wandered into the woods during a storm and never came back. But every now and then, when the wind picks up and the trees creak just right, past campers say they can still hear knocking on the windows of cabin 5. Soft, slow, relentless.
Story number 2.
In the summer of 2009, Camp Echo Pines reopened after being closed for nearly 20 years. The story around town was that the camp had been shut down after a tragic accident involving a camper drowning in the lake, but official records were vague. Just operational concerns and staffing issues. Still, the location was perfect, tucked deep in the Catskills, surrounded by silent woods, and the new owners were determined to bring it back to life. The first few weeks were normal. Kids swam, hiked, and roasted marshmallows under the stars. But then the lake began to change. It started with the fish. Dozens of them floated to the surface one morning, belly up, their eyes cloudy and bulging like they'd seen something horrifying before they died. The camp director blamed it on algae or temperature change, told the kids to stay out of the water for a few days. The very next night, one of the counselors, Eric, didn't return from his evening rounds. His flashlight was found on the dock, still on, pointing directly at the water. The lake was still, no ripples, no sign of anyone falling in. They searched with boats and diving gear, nothing. No splash had been heard, no scream. It was like he had just vanished. A few campers started whispering about a woman. They claimed she walked through the trees at night, her hair dripping wet, her clothes soaked and clinging to her body like she'd just emerged from the lake. One girl said she saw the woman standing outside the arts and crafts cabin, staring inside for nearly 10 minutes without blinking. When a counselor went out to confront her, there was no one there, and not even a single footprint in the muddy path. That's when things got worse. A boy named Jonah woke up screaming, clawing at his skin. He said she had touched him in his dream, and her fingers were freezing and bloated, like she'd been underwater too long. The counselor calmed him down, but the next morning, Jonah had red, pruned skin on his arms and legs, like he'd been submerged in water all night. Another counselor quit on the spot after hearing splashing outside his cabin window at 2 a.m., only to see two pale, lifeless hands gripping the edge of the dock. When he ran out with a flashlight, no one was there, just wet handprints slowly drying in the moonlight. The camp nurse found a newspaper clipping hidden in a supply cabinet a few days before closing. It was old, yellowed, nearly unreadable. The headline, "Camp Echo Pines Counselor Drowns After Failed Rescue Attempt, Body Never Recovered." The article talked about a teenage counselor named Rachel who had tried to save a camper caught in a rip current. The camper survived. Rachel didn't. Her body was never found. Some said she had been pulled under by something, not entirely natural. The camp closed again at the end of that summer and never reopened. Locals say the lake doesn't freeze in the winter anymore. It steams instead. Warm to the touch, even in freezing temperatures. And late at night, if you listen closely from the other side of the trees, you might hear soft, rhythmic splashes, like someone pacing back and forth in the water. Waiting, still watching.
Story number 3.
In the summer of 1997, Camp Briar Glen welcomed its usual crowd of campers, tucked deep in the Tennessee woods, surrounded by thick brush and steep hills that swallowed sound. It was one of those classic no-cell signal camps where ghost stories thrived and flashlights were sacred after dark. But that year, something was different. One of the counselors, Danny, started noticing a strange pattern. Every morning, right after the 6 a.m. bugle call, there would be a new symbol carved into one of the trees along the main trail. It wasn't graffiti or initials. These were precise, almost ritualistic. Circles with crosses, triangles within triangles, lines connecting in unnatural ways. They gave everyone the creeps. At first, they blamed a prankster. But when Danny tried to stay up and catch whoever was doing it, he fell asleep in his chair, even after drinking 2 energy drinks. He woke up with a splitting headache and a fresh carving just 10 feet from where he'd been sitting. Then, one night, the boys in cabin 3 reported hearing someone whispering through the floorboards. Not from outside, beneath the cabin. The counselors checked underneath, thinking maybe an animal had gotten trapped. But there was nothing there. No burrows, no crawl space, no sign of anything. The next night, the whispers came again. This time, all at once, every boy in the cabin sat up in bed at the same time and started talking in unison. They spoke in a low, strange language, not gibberish, something real. Their eyes were open, but unfocused, like they weren't really awake. It lasted less than a minute. Then they all collapsed back into bed like nothing happened. The nurse thought it might be some weird group sleepwalking incident, but one of the kids had a voice recorder tucked in his backpack. When they played it back, it didn't just capture the boys talking. It caught another voice, a dry, whispering voice layered underneath theirs. Deep, guttural. It said one thing, over and over again: "Open the path! Open the path! Open the path!" The camp director shut down that cabin and moved the boys elsewhere. 2 days later, Danny vanished. He was last seen walking toward the woods with a lantern just before dawn, muttering to himself. The search dogs refused to enter the forest past a certain point. They just whined and sat down, tails between their legs. Later that week, counselors found a clearing deep in the woods. A perfect circle of dirt, no grass, no leaves, just soil. In the middle, a spiral made of sticks and twine. At the center of the spiral, Danny's lantern, still lit, no wind, no sound. One of the senior staff members, an older guy named Greg, had been with the camp since the 70s. When he saw the spiral, his face went pale. He said it matched a story his grandfather told him about the Hollow Ones, beings that lived between the roots of old forests, creatures who could only come through if someone carved the right symbols and opened a path. That night, Greg quit and left camp without saying goodbye. Camp Briar Glen finished out the summer, but the final week was plagued with bad weather, constant sickness, and endless nightmares from the kids. A few of them refused to sleep. They swore that every time they closed their eyes, they saw Danny standing at the edge of the woods, not screaming, not crying, just pointing behind him toward the trees. The camp never opened again. But the strangest part? Google satellite images from 2015 still show that clearing deep in the woods, still bare, still perfectly round. And on cloudy nights, hikers in the area report flickers of lantern light moving slowly between the trees. No footsteps, no voices, just light, and something watching.
Story number 4.
In the summer of 2003, a small, lesser-known camp called Camp Stillwater Hollow opened for its final season in upstate New York. It wasn't flashy, just a few cabins, an old mess hall, and a worn-down lodge that creaked whenever the wind blew. The forest around it was dense, suffocatingly so, and during orientation, the camp director gave the usual warning: don't wander past the tree line, stay within camp borders. But they never explained why. During the second week, one of the younger campers, an 11-year-old girl named Avery, started waking up with dirt under her nails and scratches on her feet. Her counselor assumed she was sneaking out at night, but she swore she never left her bed. She said someone was calling her, softly, through the window, in a voice that sounded like her mother's, but hollow, stretched, like it was being forced through a tunnel. After the third night of this happening, the counselor nailed the window shut. That same night, she was found standing barefoot at the edge of the woods, eyes wide open, face expressionless. Her nightgown was soaked from the morning dew, and in her hand, she held a piece of bark with words carved into it: "Bring her back." They took Avery home the next day. She never spoke about it again. A few days later, a group of campers on a nature hike went missing for over 6 hours. When they finally returned, they were quiet. Wrong. They didn't remember being gone, claimed they'd just taken a longer path. But their clothes were torn, and one of them had blood on his palms. They each had the same black, crusted substance around their mouths, and none of them would eat for 2 days. That night, one of the staff members, Karen, followed a sound she described as a woman sobbing deep in the woods. She never came back. Her flashlight was found on the forest floor, pointed straight up into the trees. When another counselor retrieved it, they looked up and swore there were faces in the branches, not hanging, not real, but formed in the bark itself. Dozens of them, frozen mid-scream. More and more campers began to complain of seeing a woman walking between the cabins at night. Always the same description: tall, soaked to the bone, hair matted to her face. Some said she crawled. Some said she floated. But no one ever saw her eyes. They were too black, too deep, like wells you could fall into if you looked too long. The camp director finally gathered the counselors and told them the truth. Years ago, before the camp was built, the land had been home to a small village that vanished overnight in the 1800s. Legend said the villagers were part of a cult that worshipped something ancient buried beneath the forest, something they fed with blood and silence. When outsiders arrived and disturbed the land, it was said that the woods took someone in exchange. Always a girl, always by water. The director admitted that strange things had happened every few years, but they were always small. A missing animal, a sleepwalking camper, a voice heard in the dark, until now. The camp was evacuated early. Every child sent home. The state shut the grounds permanently. But in 2017, a group of urban explorers visited the abandoned property. They posted photos online: mold-covered bunk beds, overgrown trails, the dining hall filled with bird skeletons. But one photo stood out, taken just outside the old girl's cabin. In the picture, someone or something stood behind the cracked glass of the window. Tall, soaking wet, and staring directly into the camera.
Story number 5.
In the summer of 1992, a private Christian camp called Redwood Refuge quietly reopened in Northern California after being shut down for nearly a decade. It was nestled deep in the forest, surrounded by towering redwoods that blocked out most of the sunlight, giving the entire campgrounds a permanent dusk-like feeling. The owners didn't talk much about why it had closed in the first place, just financial problems. But the locals remembered differently. They remembered the boy who disappeared during a hike in 1983. They remembered the counselor who went missing in the same forest 3 years later. And they remembered the strange pattern of 3 loud bell chimes that sometimes echoed through the woods at night, even after the chapel bell had been removed. That summer, the camp brought in a new crop of counselors, college kids looking for easy pay and a place to disconnect. Among them was 19-year-old Mariah, who was assigned to the youngest group of campers. She loved the job at first, until the children started drawing things during craft time. Not houses or trees or animals, but tall black shapes, always the same. Figures without faces, with arms that stretched to the ground. Every drawing had red circles drawn around the eyes, even though the figures didn't have eyes. One little girl, Clara, told Mariah, "They live between the trees. If you're quiet enough, you can hear them breathing." Mariah laughed it off until she started hearing the breathing herself. At night, when everything was still, she would lie in her bunk and hear it from outside the cabin walls. This low, rattling inhale, followed by an impossibly long exhale, like something ancient and diseased was just on the other side of the wall. She wasn't the only one. The counselor in the boys' cabin reported that one of his campers had disappeared from bed for almost 2 hours and was found standing in the middle of the chapel, staring at the empty bell tower, barefoot and shaking. When asked why he was there, the boy only said, "He told me to ring it. Said it's how you wake them up." The next day, claw marks were found on the inside of the chapel doors. Not animal scratches, fingernail gouges. Desperate. Then came the night of the storm. Around 3 a.m., the entire camp was jolted awake by 3 deafening chimes. The chapel bell tower hadn't functioned in years. Everyone ran outside. Rain pouring, wind screaming, and saw the bell swinging violently in the storm, ringing loud enough to shake the trees. But no one was up there. That's when the screaming started. From the woods came the sound of multiple voices, all crying out in pain. But they weren't quite human. It was like dozens of people screaming through static, warped and slowed down. The campers were rushed back into the cabins, but one counselor never came back, Sean, a quiet guy who had been reading the camp's old journals in the library earlier that night. The next morning, a single trail of wet footprints led from the chapel steps into the woods. They weren't Sean's shoes. They were bare feet. And the prints didn't sink like normal. They just pressed into the earth, like the ground had recoiled from whatever made them. The camp closed for good the next week. Everything was boarded up, and a state official posted signs warning against unstable terrain in the surrounding woods. But in 2019, hikers found the chapel again. It was falling apart, covered in moss. The bell was gone. But someone had carved into the altar with what looked like fingernails. We rang it. They're not sleeping anymore. And behind the altar, there were more drawings, more red circles, more black figures, and in the center, written over and over in a child's messy handwriting, "Between the trees, between the trees, between the trees."
Story number 6.
In the summer of 2005, a camp called Whispering Pines opened in the outskirts of Colorado. It wasn't particularly famous or well advertised, but it attracted a decent crowd, mostly families looking for a quiet getaway from the city. The camp was nestled beside a small crystal-clear lake and bordered by thick pine forests, the perfect location for nature hikes, canoeing, and late-night campfire stories. But there was a rumor that floated around, one that no one at the camp would talk about. The older locals warned against going too far into the woods, especially near the lake at dusk. They said there were stories about the place long before the camp was built, about what had happened to the people who lived there, and the thing that still wandered the forest. Of course, none of the kids paid attention to the stories. They were more concerned with the ghostly echoes of laughter and the smell of roasted marshmallows by the fire. It started with one of the younger boys, named Danny. He was 12 years old and had a bad habit of wandering off by himself. One evening, while the counselors were setting up for the night's activities, Danny disappeared into the woods. The camp leaders assumed he was just exploring, so they gave him time to come back. But when dinner rolled around and Danny still hadn't returned, panic set in. They searched the woods for hours, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. The only clue they found was a single, fresh footprint near the edge of the lake, barefoot, wet, and smeared with something dark. It wasn't mud. Around midnight, the camp director called the authorities, but by the time the search team arrived, there was no trace of Danny, just that one footprint leading into the lake. The next morning, the camp decided to continue as planned. No one spoke much about Danny's disappearance, but the air felt off. It wasn't until the fourth day of camp that the first strange thing happened. One of the counselors, Mark, was walking near the lake when he saw something floating in the water. It was a small wooden boat, just a simple rowboat drifting slowly toward the shore, as if it had been there for hours. Mark pulled the boat to land, and that's when he noticed something on the seat. Danny's backpack. His stomach turned. He opened the bag, half expecting to find something sinister. But all that was inside was a torn-up piece of paper with something written on it in a child's handwriting. "She's still here. She's not happy." The camp tried to cover it up, but rumors spread quickly. The next night, the children began to complain of hearing whispers in the woods. At first, they blamed it on the wind, but the voices, soft, faint whispers, started getting closer, always just out of sight behind the trees. But the strangest thing, they couldn't make out the words. The whispers sounded like a woman crying, but in a language no one understood. That's when one of the older campers, Sarah, confessed that she had gone hiking near the lake the day before Danny disappeared. She said she had seen a woman, tall, with dark, hollow eyes, standing at the water's edge. She was staring into the lake, unmoving. Sarah had waved, but the woman never acknowledged her. She later described the woman as having no face, just smooth, pale skin with the impression of eyes where there shouldn't be. From that night on, more and more campers began seeing her, always near the lake, always by the trees, the woman with no face. And then came the whispers. They started telling people things, personal things, things only those who had been in the woods could know. One of the kids, a girl named Emily, started having dreams. Dreams where the woman would stand at the foot of her bed and whisper, "The water calls." On the final night of camp, the whispers reached a crescendo. The wind howled through the trees, and at the edge of the lake, campers could see something moving in the water, a shadow rising from the depths. By morning, the camp was abandoned. The buses arrived to take the kids home, but no one ever spoke about what happened in the woods. When the new owners arrived to prepare the camp for the next season, they found a small wooden boat tied to a dock. Inside, the same thing, a child's backpack and another scrap of paper. This time, the words were different. "She's waiting. She's still here." And on the shoreline where the boat had been were two sets of fresh footprints leading out into the lake. One small, the other.
Story number 7.
In the summer of 2011, a secluded camp called Stone Hollow opened its doors in the remote hills of Wyoming. Nestled deep within a valley surrounded by jagged rocks and thick woods, it promised an off-the-grid experience, offering hiking, rock climbing, and primitive survival lessons. The camp had only one road leading in and out, and cell service was non-existent. The isolation was part of its charm for those who sought an escape from the world. But there were whispers from the locals about the land long before the camp had been established. Stories about strange sounds in the night, about animals that vanished without a trace, about hikers who got lost and were never found. Still, no one thought much of it until that summer. It began with the strange occurrences during the first week. The campers were told to stay within the bounds of camp during the night, but a few of them, driven by curiosity, snuck into the surrounding woods. The camp's counselors, mostly young adults who had worked at other camps before, laughed it off as harmless teenage rebellion. That was until the first camper, a 13-year-old boy named Tommy, disappeared. He was last seen heading into the woods with a few of his friends after dark. When they returned without him the next morning, the group insisted they had split up to explore. And when they came back to the campfire, Tommy was simply gone. His friends didn't seem particularly concerned, almost as if they didn't remember where he went or why. Search teams scoured the woods for days, but they found no sign of Tommy. Not a footprint, not a broken twig, just the same, oppressive silence that seemed to hover over the forest. Then the whispers began. At first, they were subtle. A few of the younger kids heard them when they ventured out near the tree line during the day. The whispers were soft, indistinct, like the wind, but with something else mixed in, something deliberate, as if someone was trying to communicate, but in a language too old to understand. By the end of the second week, more campers had started hearing it. And then one night, when the power went out during a storm, the whispers turned into full-blown voices. The counselors, panicked and frustrated, told the kids to stay inside and quiet down, but the whispers only grew louder. The wind howled through the trees, and suddenly the sound of something footsteps could be heard circling the cabins. The air was thick, oppressive, almost suffocating. One of the counselors, Lisa, went to check the generator, but she didn't return. When the lights flickered back on, she was gone. The next morning, a child found a note pinned to the mess hall door, written in a hand that looked like it hadn't been used in years. It read, "She is awake, and she has claimed another. The forest calls." No one knew who had written it, but it only deepened the dread in the camp. As the days passed, the number of disappearances grew. Another counselor, then a camper. The camp became a shadow of its former self, with whispers and odd noises continuing at night. The kids were scared, but no one could leave. The road in and out of the valley had been washed out by the storms, and the weather had turned harsh. The camp was completely cut off. Then, on the final night before the road reopened, a group of campers huddled together in the lodge, trying to stay warm. They could still hear the whispers outside the walls. But something was different now. The whispers were louder, closer, and then at the stroke of midnight, the ground began to shake, as if something enormous was moving beneath the earth. The entire camp seemed to tremble, the air crackling with static. And then the screams started. Not from the campers, not from the counselors, from the forest itself. It sounded like hundreds of voices, distorted, tortured, pleading for help. But there was something else. The cries were mixed with something darker, something older. They were not human. The sound was like bones grinding together, like something ancient waking from a deep slumber. And through the open windows, the campers could see shapes moving in the trees. Tall, dark figures, moving unnaturally, like something that didn't belong in the world. Their eyes glowed faintly, like dim embers in the dark. By morning, when the road was finally cleared, the campers were gone. All that remained were the abandoned cabins, the mess hall, and a single trail of footprints leading into the woods. But the footprints didn't belong to any human. They were wide and clawed, with strange symbols etched into the ground as though something had dragged itself across the earth. The authorities never found the campers. The camp was abandoned, and over time, the entire area was cordoned off, deemed too dangerous for any new development. But if you visit the valley now, there's an odd stillness in the air, a sense that you're being watched. And if you listen closely, you might hear the whispers again, carried on the wind, soft and slow, calling for someone else to join the forest, calling for another.
Story number 8.
In 1987, a summer camp known as Camp Oak Ridge opened in a remote area of Vermont. Nestled between a dense forest and a serene lake, it was the perfect place for children to spend their summers. The camp was modest but charming, wooden cabins with open porches, a small mess hall, and a lake that could be seen shimmering through the trees at dawn. The camp's first few years were uneventful, but that all changed one night, during the summer of 1992, when a strange occurrence shook the camp to its core. The trouble started with one of the older campers, Jason. He was 15 years old, and for most of the summer, he had been a bit of a troublemaker, sneaking out at night, making fun of the younger kids, and generally getting into trouble. One night, after lights out, Jason disappeared. The camp staff assumed he had simply snuck off into the woods, as he had done many times before. But this time, when they called for him, there was no response. The other campers said they hadn't seen him. The counselors searched for hours, calling out his name, but there was no sign of him. The next morning, when Jason's bed was still empty, panic set in. The camp immediately contacted the authorities, and a full search was launched. The entire surrounding forest was combed, but nothing was found. No tracks, no clothing, not a single clue. 3 days passed and the search ended without a trace of Jason. Then, on the 4th day, a strange discovery was made. A group of campers found something washed up on the shore of the lake. Jason's sneakers, perfectly dry, resting on the edge of the water. The camp director, desperate for answers, ordered everyone to stay within the camp's boundaries for the rest of the summer. But the oddest thing was that, after Jason's disappearance, the atmosphere in the camp shifted. The lake seemed to take on a darker, more oppressive presence. It was always calm, too calm. The once clear water now appeared murky, even though it had been clean before. The air had a strange, heavy quality to it, as if something had settled in, something that didn't belong. The whispers started soon after. Some of the younger campers began to complain about hearing voices in the trees at night. Others said they saw shadows moving around the perimeter of the camp. But the most unsettling reports came from the campfire circle. At night, when the kids sat around the fire, they claimed to hear footsteps crunching in the underbrush, slowly getting closer, until they were right on the edge of the camp. But when they would look, there would be nothing there, just the flickering of the fire and the sound of the wind. Then, on the final night of the camp session, something happened that no one could explain. As the counselors led the kids back to their cabins, a few of them turned to look at the lake. What they saw stopped them in their tracks. Out in the center of the lake, there was something, a dark figure standing in the water. It was tall and unmoving, like it was waiting for something. Its shape was hard to make out through the mist, but the figure was undeniably human-shaped. For a moment, everyone froze, watching. Then, without warning, the figure vanished beneath the surface. The counselors immediately called the police, but when the authorities arrived, the lake was as still as it had ever been. There were no signs of any kind of disturbance. But that night, as the camp closed its doors for the season, there was something else. The whispers returned. Only this time, they were louder, more urgent. They came from everywhere, inside the cabins, outside in the woods, and most chillingly, from the lake itself. The sound was indistinguishable, like a low murmur, barely audible, but so persistent that it made your skin crawl. In the days that followed, the camp was closed indefinitely, the staff citing unforeseen circumstances, but the lake and the surrounding woods remained undisturbed. The camp never reopened. The authorities later investigated the land's history and found a chilling revelation. Long before the camp was built, the area had been home to a small settlement. The settlers had abandoned the area after reports of strange, inexplicable drownings in the lake. The locals claimed the water had a will of its own and would sometimes pull people in if they ventured too close at night. The camp was eventually abandoned and left to rot, with the cabins falling into disrepair. Yet every year, on the anniversary of Jason's disappearance, hikers in the area report seeing a dark figure standing at the center of the lake, waiting, and every so often, someone hears it again, the whisper.